Welcome to another Early Years Learning Hub podcast. My name is Jackie Ward and I'm the founder and managing director of the Early Years Learning Hub. This episode is one of our Unpacking Theory and Research series where I invite academics or experts in a particular area to share how theory, research and contemporary understandings influence our work as teachers, educators and leaders. Today, I'm joined by Beck Thompson, who is the founder of Trauma Informed Teachers Australia. She's also a practice teacher right now and a speaker and author of the book Chasing Normal. So we're going to be talking about trauma-informed practice and the science behind it. So Beck, would you like to tell us, our listeners, a little bit about yourself and your professional journey?
Sure. Thanks, Jackie, for having me on. So I guess for me, where it all started was I have lived experience of childhood trauma. So most of my childhood years were filled with childhood trauma. So, and, you know, I just kind of moseyed on into university and went and got an education degree. And it's funny because when I was teaching it, for me, it was more about were the students okay? I was more sort of interested in their emotional development and well-being, I guess, than in their learning, because it really took me back to what I needed at school. And so when I started writing my memoir, Chasing Normal, I started reflecting on what it was that really helped me pull through life and get through and sort of get to the other side like I did. And I realised it was actually the teachers that created these amazing moments for me that helped me to build resilience and build a self-worth and have belief in me that really helped me get going. That was kind of, and then I started sharing stories with educators on what it was like for me in the classroom and what often teachers really missed about why I couldn't concentrate and why learning was so difficult, why I was so needy as a student as well, and why I really gravitated so much towards being around my teachers. And so I started sharing stories on the background of all that. And hence that's kind of why I started Trauma Informed Teachers Australia, because I wanted to really help teachers become aware of how powerful and impactful their presence is. And so that's kind of where I am now, where I run this community. We're nearly 5,000 teachers strong. And again, I also use that to speak at schools, and again, just giving insight into what it's like for a student who has lived experience of trauma, whether it's ongoing or whether it's happened to them in their past, and what the impact that teachers actually have in their lives.
Well, thank you for sharing that, Beck, and thank you for all the work that you've done in helping teachers understand that better, because I've got to say it's probably only in the last 5 to 10 years that I've really sort of, I guess, understood trauma as a separate concept, and that it would have such an impact on children in so many ways that are not necessarily as, I guess, obvious or overt connections as what you might think. So for any one of our listeners who's not sure what we mean by trauma, so can we sort of start off by understanding trauma a little bit, why it's so important for teachers to understand, and what sort of experiences, I guess, children might have that are traumatic?
So, I mean, I guess, you know, there's a few different definitions on trauma, but, you know, the one that I like the most is that an experience or repeated experience that overwhelms a child's capacity to cope. And so, like you said, educators really weren't given any understanding of trauma with students and the fact that they experience trauma, let alone how that actually impacts their learning. And like you, I graduated over 25 years ago now, and it wasn't even on the radar in our 4-year degree. It just wasn't even talked about. We talked about developmental milestones like walking and talking and socializing and sharing and, you know, things like that, and how we move from concrete to abstract in as far as our learning path. But in no way did we learn how trauma actually is a really big deal as far as how it interrupts not only does it does absolutely interrupt our development, but it actually interrupts our brain and our capacity to learn. And And I guess, you know, and it's so many different ways that it impacts a child, and it can be quite overt, and we can see how trauma has shaped the child by the way that they behave. You know, they might not be able to contain the overwhelm, and so the capacity to even sit and be present is greatly reduced. We call that, I guess, we call that fight or flight. But then you've got the other side of it, and this is where I probably resonate the most because I was like this, is that we shut down. So we can completely dissociate and shut down and freeze, where the impact of trauma is so severe that there's just no, or there's limited capacity to be able to reach the thinking brain. So, and that might look like, you know, daydream or stalling or being forgetful or disinterested, or, you know, not even having the capacity to retain what's being instructed to you. And so a lot of these students will look like they're not listening. So for a teacher, that might look frustrating because you feel, you know, you sort of want to know, well, I've said it once, I've said it twice. But a lot of these kids who are in that survival brain are just really just trying to cope with the internal experience of how it's affecting them. So it varies. And, you know, I guess the main point is that it does have an impact. And as educators, we're learning now that we can't simply expect students to walk in the door and just flick a switch and be ready and on task.
That's so true. And I guess you've mentioned it a few times there, the brain and the thinking brain and the other brains. And I was thinking also of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, you know, that physical need for safety is such a bottom level kind of thing and further up the chain. But how does brain science, I guess, help us approach challenging behaviours or disconnected kids if we see it through that lens?
Well, you know, in recent years, I have, through reading, I got onto a book called it's going to lose me now. The Boy Who Was Raised as a Dog by Dr. Bruce Perry. And he is a renowned child psychiatrist who worked for decades with some of our most traumatic children in America. And then he went on to write a phenomenal book called Born for Love. And he talks a lot about the neurobiology and how our brain is actually shaped by the experiences that we have repeatedly. And so it's that kind of, the brain can't use what it doesn't have. The brain can't behave if it hasn't had those input of experiences. And so Dr. Bruce Perry actually developed what we call the neurosequential model. And I'm not a big fan of models, but when I studied this last year, it was the clearest for me, most simplified way of understanding how students' brains are impacted by trauma and how we can kind of detect where they are in their brains as far as what they're exhibiting in the classroom. And so he developed the sequential model where, you know, we understand that all sensory information comes in through the bottom part of our brain, the brain stem, where all our regulation and autonomic things happen, like heartbeat, pressure, blood pressure, heart rate, all those things. And that's when he talked about regulation, how important regulation is, because in trauma, often the brainstem where that information comes in, it becomes very disorganized with a student who is constantly overwhelmed and anxious. And so he talked about the fact that we need to be organizing the lower part of the brain. And the best way to do that was through movement, rhythmic movement. So walking, dancing, drumming, running, and he said it only needs to be 4 to 7 minutes. And then he walks us through to, you know, we need to have some form of connection. So we need to know that someone cares about us, that we have someone to call on, someone to rely on in order to feel safe and present. And it's those things like conversations, checking in on a student, spending time getting to know them in the moments that you can, and just showing them that someone cares about them. And so he explains that when we have regulation and connection, then he actually uses the upside down triangle. That opens up the cortex, our top part of the brain, for learning. And what I love about this model is it is sequential, which means we can't skip a step. And it's why they often advocate that you can't reason to a child who is dysregulated. You can't reason with the child while they're heightened, while their stress response is high. So we need to use the neurosequential model in first regulating this child, organising those parts of the brain at the bottom first, and then, building in some connection and empathy kind of routines to give them more capacity to learn. That's, to me, I followed Bruce Perry for a while now, is one of the best ways to help educators understand that the brain develops in sequence. And as much as educators are taught to speak to the thinking brain, it is a cognitive process. Those bottom parts of the brain actually need to be regulated and sorted before we can actually access the top part. So, and I just think it's such a, there's not a lot of thought that has to go into it. We don't need to be neuroscientists. We just need to understand that it is a sequence. The brain doesn't skip a step. And so if we want to reach that part of the kids' brains, that we need to first do those things in order to reach our students.
Well, there's so many other things that we might think about, like neurodiversity, that children would probably benefit from that movement, and just generally, to be not just sitting down doing the one task or lots of sedentary tasks for a while. If you think about, there's so many things that, would be great about that idea of moving.
Yeah.
I'm interested thinking about looking through a trauma lens. You speak about the importance of safety in the classroom. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? Like, what did that look like for you, I guess?
Well, I guess, and I usually say this in my presentations, that especially when my trauma sort of began in grade 2, I don't remember a lot of my grade 2 and 3. And because at the time, I still remember looking in the classroom, and even though I did have 20/20 vision in grade 2, it didn't seem like it. It seemed like I had a very blurred vision because my trauma and the time frame at which it happened, it was so quick, the way my life changed so abruptly. Most adults wouldn't cope with that kind of switch so quickly. And so I was only 7, and my life was so abruptly different, and so, it was very abusive. So I'm just trying to cope in that environment. And I just remember having to sit there, and I disassociated an enormous amount. I don't really remember grade 2 or 3. And it wasn't until I got to grade 4 that my teacher, I always say he's ahead of his time, because he was really quite emphatic about movement in class, and it was something that he did every day, and we would just, it was just routine. We got out and we moved, and we played a game for 15-20 minutes every single morning. So there was that. And he also just had that, he had so many characteristics that really helped me survive the classroom. And he was, he was warm, he was funny, he was very supportive. He's very patient, and he also noticed things about me that even at the time I, would never have seen because of my environment, which is, because what's sort of hard, I guess, for educators to understand is that when you're living in an environment that is extremely abusive and there's no support, there's no one to lean on, that overwhelms everything, and of course, you're going home to that. So then the anxiety of knowing what you're going home to also interrupts your ability to, try and be in the classroom, because you're worried about, well, what am I going home to today? Because there's no predictability. And predictability is critical for a child's safety in the classroom. And so safety is really just, can I be here, and can I tolerate what's here? For me, it's, does this child know that there's someone here? Do my actions and my routines and the way I interact with this student, do they teach this child that I am a safe person, that the nervous system can go, yep, I know I'm okay here. I don't have to second guess. I don't have to worry about what's happening next, because no matter what happens, the teacher's going to be that anchor for me. So
Yeah, that's so
safety,
true.
yeah, it's just, and it allows that, in a way, what I sort of look at it like, it allows that fight or flight response to relax, because the brain's not trying to go, oh, do I need protecting right now? Do I need to, because that's what happens with trauma affected brains, is that they're always running as a way to protect themselves. Like the guards are up, there's always guards up. And while the guards are up, a child's going to be more focused on whether they've got to defend themselves or whether or not they're safe enough to learn.
Yeah, that's so true. And I always think children too deserve adults that are really invested in them, and I think, I'm a big fan of having high expectations for children as well, but you can't have high expectations for children unless you have a relationship with them and know that you're, as the adult, is also going to scaffold them and all those sorts of things. So that
Absolutely.
psychological safety, I think, is so important.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
I think we've talked a lot about this already, but I guess I'm giving you the opportunity if there's anything you feel you haven't covered. So you often speak about teachers making a big difference and having a powerful impact on children's lives. Is there any other stories that you have yourself or that you've heard from other people when you share your story of how teachers have made a difference, I guess, in children's lives?
Only that, well, I mean, it's so funny. I actually just mentioned this on the trauma page the other day. Went to a Josh Groban concert in Brisbane the other night. He's an American singer, classical, sort of operatic almost, but I've been a fan for a long time. I've pretty much gone to everything he's ever done in Australia. But it was so interesting that he was sitting at the piano, and he's a guy who he's had enormous success with his singing. He's just got a beautiful voice. Released many very successful albums, but he relayed a story that said, I was chronically anxious as a child. He said, I had such debilitating anxiety to the point where when he was in choir class, he used to hide at the back because he was so afraid of being seen. But he said, the piano was my place where I felt safe. And he actually said, the piano is my therapy. And he goes, I remember my art teacher and my piano teacher really helping me to believe in myself. And they constantly encouraged me that I had potential, that I could do this, that I had a talent in singing and I had a talent in piano. And he said, it was really lovely actually. He said, I want to give a shout out to all the teachers because you really do make a difference. And I just went, that's an amazing story because, for him to say that he had debilitating anxiety is so hard to believe
Yeah.
because he's on stage. He does this all over the world. I think he was even on the Oscars. He did a little bit on the Oscars. I just caught it
Wow.
before. So, it's, I love stories like that because we often look, especially to celebrities and people on the world stage, and we think, gosh, you've just always had it, but
Yeah.
little do we know that behind many, many successful people, there's a teacher who
Yeah.
believed in them. And that's what I love. I always love hearing those kind of stories because we forget the impact that teachers often have on our students. And yeah, that's probably my most
Yeah.
recent one that I thought of.
That's
Yeah.
a goodie. I think that's such an important thing that you mentioned there too, because I know that I don't think anyone fully understands the weight of a teacher and how much we have to do every day. I don't only mean like jobs and things, but it's quite a lot of pressure and there's quite a lot of responsibility. You make a lot of decisions every day. You're looking after those children's safety and all that kind of stuff. And especially if there's, some children with some violent behaviors and stuff in your classroom. So I think it's so important to never forget that you have such an important role as a teacher and that you do make a difference in someone's whole life. The last thing I just wanted to touch base on, I know when we were talking about, did you want to say something, Beck?
Oh, yeah, no, I was just going to agree. I always think, what if you're the only one? Because for
Yeah,
me, particularly, those teachers in my life were literally, and I say that completely, that they were the only ones I had. So I often think, gosh, if those teachers hadn't come in and showed me an ounce of care, I'm not sure where I would be. So
So
I
true.
don't think people understand that if there's no one at home, and a lot of these kids don't, then the teacher has them for 6 hours a day. That's a huge impact, a potential to impact a life.
That is so true. We haven't even touched on intergenerational trauma, which could be one of the reasons why people don't have anyone at home, is that their parent is experiencing trauma, and that can often be something we need to support families with and whatnot. But that's another podcast, I think. And what I did want to finish on is an expression you used when we were chatting and planning the podcast, and I absolutely love it: connection before curriculum, because I think it's so important in general, even if we weren't talking about trauma-informed practice, but that we have that connection with children as people, because I think children need to be seen and valued, as I said before. But can you speak to how teachers do this in their everyday and some of the things that make the biggest difference for children, in your opinion?
Well, I think I always go to, because it's said so often, and we see it a lot in writing, and it's often, I'm involved in a lot of teacher pages on Facebook, so I read a lot of stuff, and it can be easy to throw it away as, just a throwaway line. But I will always say, from my personal experience and the way that I approach my own students that I work with, is that I don't care about anything until I know someone cares about me. So I always think about that when, I'm working with a student who is really struggling. The last thing I'm going to do is go, come on, we're just going to do this maths work, because I know they don't care. They will
Yeah.
care when they know I care about them first. And so that's why, for me, it's always about, let's do a little bit of movement. And it kind of sounds a bit, rigid in a routine kind of fashion, but I always do a little bit of, hey, let's just do some movement, or, I'll make it fun with some kind of, just dance or something. But it's really just about connecting with where they're at in that moment. And one of my favourite recent stories was a child I had last year, and I had him quite often, and he just, because he was probably a bit low in English. And every time we had some kind of literacy task, you could see it. He'd start shutting down, he'd start looking around the room, he'd get up and he'd want to run around and all that sort of stuff. And I kind of had watched for a bit before I went, okay, there's something going on. Every time I noticed a pattern, and I went to him and I just said, hey, what's going on? And just inviting a conversation, nothing about curriculum, nothing about the task, because they don't care. There's something going on for them that is overriding their capacity to cope and their capacity to care about the task. And I'm very frank about that, because that's the truth. So anyway, we were talking and I said, do you like any sports? And he said how much he loved AFL. Now, I'm a Victorian by birth. I live in Queensland now, but I went, oh, okay, you've got my attention. Anyway, we were just talking about who his favourite footy players were and his team, and I said, do you want to play footy next at break? And he looked at me and he went, really? And I went, yeah. And of course I did. Every session he was asking, are we going out again, Miss Beck? Are we going out again? And I said, yep, we're going out again. But what that did was we built something that was far more important than the task at hand. And that changed the dynamic of our relationship in class. And it also broke down some barriers for him that said, I can't do this, I'm struggling with this. And by me relating to him on a completely different level with something completely unrelated to the task at hand, it built trust and reduced threat. And so he felt comfortable enough with me to ask for help, or to sit with me and work through a problem. And so that's why, it's those things of building that connection. That's tricky in itself, because teachers are just so busy and what they've got on their plate is enormous. So I do have sympathy absolutely for that. But anything you can do where you get into their inner world and actually take an interest in that inner world, like, oh, you like that, and oh, you're really good at that, and is just a way to say this teacher cares about what's going on for me. They care about me and my world. I've found that to be one of the most effective ways to help a student cope in class and to work with me in class. So it's like I said, that's why it's just those little things. So I say my tagline actually for Trauma Informed Teachers Australia is little moments, lasting impact, because it is the little things that we can do to build that connection and allow that child to feel safe and trusting enough to actually learn.
Love it. And a great way to finish the podcast. And we'll put a link to so you've got Trauma Informed Teachers Facebook page, which we'll put a link into the show notes. And people also access your book as well, Chasing Normal. We'll put a link to that as well.
Yep. Yes, that's available.
Okay, cool. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Beck, and hope everybody has enjoyed this episode. And don't forget to rate us and follow us on Spotify and Apple Podcast. Thanks, Beck.
Thank you. Thanks, Jackie.